It's 6:30 in the morning, the 29th of May, 1945, 600 miles behind Japanese lines over central Siam. A single aircraft is letting down through the last of the darkness towards a drop zone it will never reach. She's an American-built B-24 Liberator wearing Royal Air Force roundels, P for Peter, and she's been in the air for 6.5 hours. There are 14 men aboard, 9 aircrew, 4 American intelligence officers, and 1 more agent whose job tonight is simply to watch. Peter's front turret is gone. Her ball turret is gone. Her beam guns and her armor plating, gone. All of it, stripped out months ago to make room for cargo. She is, for all practical purposes, a flying truck. Her defense has always been darkness. And this morning, for the first time in a year and a half, the sky over Siam is perfectly, mercilessly clear. At the controls is the captain. He's flown 24 of these missions. This is his 25th, the last one, the end of his tour. Tomorrow, the plan is Darjeeling, leave, mountain air, a reunion with his best friend from school. He is 12 days past his 21st birthday. Then the intercom crackles. The bomb aimer's voice. Enemy fighters, 2 o'clock, 9 of them. Welcome to the 34th episode of Memory and Valor, a podcast dedicated to resurrecting the lives and sacrifices of Canadian veterans and soldiers of the First World War. Today, we deviate from that war and move into the Second World War. I'm your host, Samantha McCrae. Thanks for joining me at the crossroads where memory and valor meet. The young man at the controls of that Liberator was my first cousin, twice removed. His name was Harry Vincent Smith. His friends called him Smithy. I called him Cousin Harry. And today, I get to tell you his story. So sit back, grab a drink of something, get comfy, because this is a good one. Before we get to Harry, though, I want you to hear what the wider war above Burma actually sounded like, because Harry's flying was strange, even by the standards of that theater. And it helps to know what normal looked like first. Not every Canadian in that sky was flying blacked out and unescorted into secret drop zones the way Harry was. Most of the Burma Air War looked completely different. Daylight, close support, low-level attacks, the kind of flying where you dive on a target you can see with your own eyes, and the men on the ground can see you just as clearly. Frederick Howard Sproule was born in Vancouver on the 22nd of September 1918. He started out as an Army cadet with the Seaforth Highlanders before switching to the Air Force, training first as a gunner and then as a pilot. By the time he reached Burma, he was flying Hawker Typhoons on ground attack missions against Japanese positions. In this clip, he describes one particular morning raid on a pair of Japanese-held pagodas, and just how close it came to being his last flight. Here's Frederick Sproule.
Early in the morning, 7 o'clock in the morning, and we were to bomb 2 pagodas on each side of the road. The Japanese were dug in at the base of them. So, and I was leading the squadron, and we went around, and we came around south of it, and then we were going to head down into it like this. And just as I came around, they started firing ack fire at us. And one of them hit on the port side of the cockpit. And I could see the muzzle blast from this ack gun. When it leaves, there's a great big blast. And I don't know whether the other fellows saw it. I pointed it out to them. But as I went down, I didn't know what had been hit or broken. All I was concerned about was I had bombed and gone around again, and when I saw them, then I was going to go down and strafe it. And when I fired my guns, I had a stoppage in one gun, so I had 1-303. But I sprayed it around where the muzzle blast was, but I don't know. And turned the squadron over to another guy. By this time, the fellow's pretty well at all bombed. And I got to my number 2 to check to see whether the underneath was all right. He said it looked all right. So I went in and landed, and mind you, it's pretty early in the morning. There's no wind, but I didn't have any hydraulics, so I had no brakes. Anyway, she just ran straight as a die and stopped in front of the control tower.
That's the theater Harry Smith flew in. Daylight strafing runs at treetop height on one end of it, and on the other end, exactly the kind of flying you're about to hear about. Solo, unarmed, at night, 600 miles behind the lines. 2 very different wars fought in the same sky by men who mostly never met each other. Now, back to Harry. Regular listeners will know that this podcast usually lives in an earlier war. We spend our time in the trenches with the Canadian Expeditionary Force at Vimy, on the Somme, at Regina Trench. And you may remember that 2 weeks ago I told you about the Hines brothers of Newfoundland, about Harry Hines, killed at Beaumont Hamel on the 1st of July, 1916, and the telegram that arrived at his mother's door. Well, it turns out my family received 2 of those telegrams. 29 years apart, different war, different ocean, almost the same words. This is the story of the second one, and I'll warn you now, this one has a different ending. Harry Vincent Smith was born in Winnipeg, Manitoba on the 17th of May, 1924 to Roy Hodgson Smith and Eleanor Hilton Smith of 26 Furby Street. And Eleanor is where this story becomes mine because Eleanor was my great-grandma's sister. Frances Delina Smith was my great-grandmother, Eleanor was her sister, and Harry was Eleanor's boy. So Harry and my grandmother were first cousins, which means that when the telegram we'll meet later in this episode arrived at Furby Street, it didn't stop there. News like that never stops at one door. It moved through the sisters, through the kitchens and telephone lines of a Winnipeg family, my family, the same way the Beaumont Hamel telegram had moved through the Hines family a generation before. Harry grew up in the St. James neighborhood on the city's west side. St. James Public School, then 5 years at St. James Collegiate. His service file, bless the bureaucratic thoroughness of the Royal Canadian Air Force, even recorded his sports. Things like rugby, hockey, skiing, basketball. A prairie kid, in other words. A thoroughly ordinary, thoroughly Canadian boyhood, right up until the world caught fire. Now, here's the first detail in this story that stopped me cold, and it's sitting right there on the front of his service record. Harry turned 18 on the 17th of May, 1942. He enlisted on the 18th. One day. He waited exactly one day, and he didn't go alone. His best friend from school, Jim Gibson, joined up in the same month. Remember that name because Jim Gibson is going to wander back into this story at the strangest possible moment in a city neither of those 2 Winnipeg boys had any earthly business being anywhere near. Dr. Tim Cook has written about this generation, the young men of what he calls the necessary war, and how enlistment in 1942 wasn't the flag-waving rush of 1914. It was quieter than that, steadier. By the spring of 1942, Canadians knew exactly what modern war did to young men. They'd had a generation to think about it. Harry's own city had sent thousands into the trenches a war earlier. The boys of 1942 signed up anyway, clear-eyed, one day past their 18th birthday. And here's where this story, for one brief chapter, comes home to us, because aircraftman Second Class Harry Smith's first posting, the very first place the Air Force sent him, was number 3 Manning Depot, Edmonton. Now, if you've walked with me through my Greaseball episode, you know this ground. Manning Depot was where the Air Force turned civilians into airmen, or at least into people who could march, salute, and make a bed to regulation. Thousands of recruits funneled through Edmonton in those years. Inoculations, drill, aptitude tests, and above all, waiting to find out what you'd be. Every recruit wanted pilot. Most didn't get it, but Harry did. From Edmonton, the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan took over Harry's life. And if you'll allow me one of my favorite digressions, the plan deserves it. This was Canada's great war-winning machine. Over 150 schools scattered across the country, turning out tens of thousands of aircrew for the entire Commonwealth. The official history of the RCAF calls it one of Canada's most significant contributions to Allied victory. The Americans had their arsenals and their shipyards. Canada had the sky over the prairies, flat, empty, far from any enemy, and absolutely perfect for teaching teenagers to fly. Harry's path through the plan never left Saskatchewan. Initial training school in Saskatoon, October to December 1942. Ground school, mathematics, navigation theory, and the endless sorting of who would be a pilot, who a navigator, who a gunner. He passed with 87.6%. Then elementary flying training at Prince Albert in the first weeks of 1943. Little yellow trainers, first solos, a 19-year-old alone in the air over the snow. Then back to Saskatoon to number 4 service flying training school and the aircraft that would quietly bookend his entire life. The Cessna Crane, a twin-engined trainer for the boys streamed toward bombers. Hold that thought about the Crane. I mean it. We'll come back to it at the very end of this episode, 40 years and several thousand miles from here, and I promise you it's worth the wait. On the 25th of June, 1943, Harry Smith stood on a parade square in Saskatoon and had the pilot's flying badge pinned to his chest, his wings. He was commissioned pilot officer the same day. He was 19 years old, and the class standings in his file say he finished 17th of his course. A solid, unshowy, middle of the strong pack, which, if you've been listening to this podcast for a while, you'll recognize as exactly the kind of man armies and air forces are actually built from. And then the Air Force did something with Harry Smith that almost nobody in Winnipeg would have predicted. Because in 1943, if you were a prairie boy with fresh wings and a bomber stream classification, everyone knew where you were going. Bomber Command, England, the night war over the Ruhr. That was the story. That was the pipeline. Harry duly shipped out through Y Depot in Halifax in the summer of 1943, crossed the Atlantic, and landed in the great holding pattern of Bournemouth with thousands of other Canadian aircrew, all waiting for the posting that would decide whether they lived or died. Harry's posting, when it came, wasn't Yorkshire. It was India. In January 1944, Harry Vincent Smith arrived in a theater most Canadians at home could not have found on a map. The war against Japan in Southeast Asia, the campaign history remembers as the Forgotten War, fought at the far end of the longest supply line on Earth. The official history records some thousands of RCAF personnel serving in the Royal Air Force squadrons across Southeast Asia Command. And their war ran on different rules than the one their friends were fighting over Germany. Different enemy, different weather. And in this theater, the weather was very nearly a combatant in its own right. We'll meet the monsoon properly later on. Different everything. India tried to kill Harry before the Japanese ever got a look at him. In October 1944, his medical file records a diagnosis of infective hepatitis, jaundice in the language of the day, a disease that hollowed out Allied ranks in that theater as reliably as enemy action. He recovered, and by the autumn of 1944, he was posted to a unit with one of those gloriously unglamorous wartime names, number 1673 Heavy Conversion Unit, the finishing school, the place where pilots who had learned to fly on twin-engine cranes were converted onto the aircraft they'd fight in. The American-built consolidated B-24 Liberator, 4 engines, 10 crew, enormous range. And that range is the whole reason Harry's story goes where it goes. Because on the 8th of November, 1944, number 1673 Heavy Conversion Unit was dissolved, and its people were used on the spot to form a brand new squadron, number 358 Squadron, Royal Air Force. Harry didn't get posted to the secret squadron. He was standing there when it was born. What the Air Force had planned for number 358 Squadron and what happened on its very first night of special operations, when 11 liberators went out and 3 didn't come back, that's where we're headed next. Jashore, Bengal, February 1945, about 70 miles northeast of Calcutta, in a country that today lies in Bangladesh, sits in an airfield that does not officially do anything at all. 2 squadrons fly from here, 357 and 358, and if you asked what they did, the answer officially was nothing much. No bombing raids to report, no victories to paint on the nose. What they actually did was fly alone at night, without escort, deeper into enemy territory than almost anyone else in the Second World War, delivering secret agents and supplies to resistance movements scattered across Burma, Malaya, Siam, French Indochina, and the Dutch East Indies. Their customers were the clandestine services, so Britain's Special Operations Executive operating out here as Force 136, the American OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the ancestor of the CIA, and the Free French. Harry, decades later, opened his memoir with what that flying was actually like. And I want you to hear his own words because no narrator can improve on them. So he said, and I quote, "Takeoffs were in the afternoons to give the maximum number of hours under the cover of night while over enemy territory. This often provided spectacular sunsets outbound and colorful sunrises many hours later on the return flight. The blackness of night also enabled us to penetrate the monsoon weather fronts by flying between the lightning flashes emitting from the ever-present cumulonimbus clouds." End quote. Read that again in your mind. Flying between lightning flashes. So that's not a figure of speech. That is the actual navigation technique. You're 20 years old. You're the captain of a 4-engine bomber with no escort and most of its guns removed, and your route through the worst weather system on the planet is the gaps between the lightning. And the aircraft made it possible. The consolidated B-24 Liberator, not a beautiful machine. Pilots called her the flying boxcar, and worse. But she had the 2 things this war demanded: range and payload. The squadron pushed forth to the ragged edge. Front turret removed, ball turret removed, beam guns, armor plate removed, everything sacrificed for cargo and fuel. Harry's cruise took off at 64,000 pounds, the absolute permitted maximum. And, as Bill Pugh noted dryly in his account, many flights ran as much as 9,000 pounds over even that. Let me give you Harry's tour in numbers, because his logbook survives in his memoir as a plain, small table. And it's one of the most quietly staggering documents I've ever worked with. 25 operational sorties between the 27th of January and the 28th of May, 1945. So 4 months. His first op, Vientiane, French Indochina, 12 and a half hours, an 8-hour run to Burma was, his words, quote, considered only a circuit and bump, end quote. A training hop. 7 of the 25 went to French Indochina in support of Free French networks. Hold on to that thread, because in November 1945, it comes back with General de Gaulle's signature attached. And then there's Mission 24, the 26th of May, 1945, Singapore. 4 Australian operatives were harassing the Japanese from a hideout in the mountains, and somebody had to keep them supplied. The round trip covered roughly 3,000 miles, flown at 500 feet above the sea the entire way to stay under Japanese radar. 3 of the aircraft's 4 bomb bays carried nothing but extra fuel. All that distance, all that risk, to deliver 4 containers. Time airborne, 24 hours and 20 minutes. That is believed to be among the longest operational sorties flown by anyone in any air force in the entire war. Now, here's the cost of all of this, and I'm going to let Cousin Harry himself deliver it, because he carried this number for 60 years. Number 358 Squadron began operations in November 1944 with 28 crews. So Harry says, quote, his 358 Squadron lost 24 of 28 of the original flight crews during 6 months of operations from November 1944 to June 1945. End quote. 24 of 28 in 6 months. There were bomber command squadrons over Germany, statistically among the most dangerous places a Canadian could serve, that did not suffer like that. And nobody at home had ever heard of these men, because the whole point of the squadron was that nobody ever would. The squadron had announced its own arithmetic on its very first night in the trade. The 22nd of January 1945, 11 liberators went out on special duties around Hanoi. 3 did not come back. That was the opening bid, before Harry had flown a single one of his 25. By late May 1945, Harry Smith had beaten those odds 24 times. He was 12 days past his 21st birthday. VE Day had come and gone 3 weeks earlier. The war in Europe was over. The bells had rung, and out here, it changed precisely nothing except the workload. One more sortie and his tour was complete. There was already a plan for what came next. He would go on leave in the cool mountain air of Darjeeling with Jim Gibson, the best friend from St. James, who joined up with him in May of 1942, now flying as a bomb aimer with 356 Squadron. The reunion was booked for July. And on the evening of 28th of May, 2 keyed up to rest, Harry finished the Mickey Spinelli novel he'd been reading. The title, and I promise you I'm not making this up, it's right there in his memoir, was You Only Die Once. Then he went to the station cinema, where the picture that night was For Whom the Bell Tolls. His own comment 50 years later was, what could be more prophetic? At 1 minute to midnight, P for Peter released her brakes and rolled into the dark. The briefing, as Harry recorded it, had been almost casual. Quote, Smith, You will be dropping 3 OSS agents and 14 containers into a drop zone near the town of Korat, Siam. There will be an OSS observer along to witness the drop. Your takeoff time is 0 hours to place you over the drop zone at dawn. Your aircraft is P for Peter. Good luck." End quote. So 14 men went aboard that night, 9 crew. Harry in the left seat, Flight Sergeant Bob Poole beside him as second pilot. Lofty, Brenchley, navigating, Jack Draper, bomb aimer, wireless operators Timber Woods and Bill Pugh, Bill Pinkney in the mid-upper turret, Curly Copley in the tail, and dispatchers Taffy Parsons and Jim Ramsey Rowe, whose job was to put the passengers out the hatch over the drop zone. And the passengers, Major John Gildy, Lieutenant Reed Moore, Sergeant McCarthy, Corporal Naparolsky, the OSS team, 3 to jump, 1 to observe. There was one more thing about this trip, and everyone aboard knew it. It was the first sortie flown under a brand new policy. Drops would now be made at dawn or dusk instead of in the dead of night, which meant P for Peter would be coming home in broad daylight, 600 miles behind Japanese lines, in an aircraft whose defensive armament had been stripped to 2 turrets. Harry's own assessment in his memoir has all the gallows cheer of a man who knew exactly what that math said. Quote, "Oh well, there are always plenty of clouds to take cover in. Sure." End quote. 2 exclamation marks. 50 years later, he was still being sarcastic about it. They crossed the coast of Siam at 4:15 in the morning. At 6:30, coastal mountains behind them, Harry began the descent toward 500 feet, and the sky betrayed them. For the first time in a year and a half, after 18 months of monsoon murk that these crews had cursed and hidden inside, the morning came up completely, perfectly clear. Harry's words, quote, "Wall-to-wall Kavu, no hiding place today," end quote. Then Jack Draper's voice on the intercom, "Enemy fighters, 2 o'clock. 9 of them, KI-43s. The fighter the Allies codenamed Oscar, and they came on with a plan. 3 setting up a racetrack pattern for head-on attacks, 3 more working the starboard corridor, 3 strafing from above and below. They had done the arithmetic too. They knew where a stripped-down special duties liberator couldn't shoot back, and that's precisely where they parked. I'm going to step back now and let Harry fly this part himself." So reading from his memoir, I quote, "I began violent evasive maneuvers and dove for the deck. The frontal attacks were devastating. We were systematically being shot to pieces. Lofty Brenchley, navigator, was killed in one of the first attacks. Bill Pinkney, mid-upper gunner, fired steady bursts at the fighters coming in head-on until he too was hit. Soon the flight deck was in a shambles with cannon shells and bullets slamming about everywhere. The noise was deafening." End quote. Harry ordered Bob Poole to jettison the containers, anything to lighten the dying aircraft. The toggle sat between the pilot seats, and as Bob Poole reached for it, he was hit full in the chest. The wound killed him, and in killing him, it straightened his body and dragged the toggle through in one motion, too fast for the bomb bay doors. 5 containers fell free. The rest jammed in the bay. Even the aircraft's last chance to shed weight was taken by the same burst that took her co-pilot. The fighters worked P for Peter over with a kind of methodical patience. Starboard elevator, radios, generator panel, engine controls, instruments, 3 engines gone, airspeed bleeding away, too low to jump. And here's the moment where every thread of this man's life pulls tight at once. A prairie kid, trained on the wide open fields of Saskatchewan, reached back past the Air Force entirely to something older and more Canadian than any of it. And here it is, again, in Harry's words. Quote, "The only hope of survival was to try the treetop landing technique used by Canadian bush pilots. At the last minute, I lowered the flaps to reduce the airspeed and dropped the undercarriage to absorb some of the energy of the impact. When the sound of the trees began scraping along the belly of the aircraft, I braced both feet against the instrument panel and hauled back on the control column with all my might. Even with the co-pilot's inert body draped over the controls, the strength born of necessity helped me pull the B-24 into a full stall. The wings, with their load of fuel, sheared off right away. Good riddance, I thought." End quote. The bush pilot's trick. Stall her into the canopy and let the trees take the energy a piece at a time. The wings tore away and carried their fuel and the fire off with them, which is very likely the single fact that let anyone walk away. The fuselage plowed on through the forest and came to rest. 9 of the 14 were alive. Harry believed, and he may well have been right, that they were the first people ever to survive a crash landing in a B-24. He crawled out through a hole in the fuselage and, one by one, the living were pulled from the wreck while Japanese fighters strafed the crash site and ammunition cooked off in the flames. Bill Pugh hanging upside down by a trapped foot, a bullet through one hand. McCarthy, his back broken. Gildy, collarbone snapped. Reed Moore, burned. Parsons, shot through the foot. And Corporal Naparolsky, with a wound in his abdomen that everyone could see would not be survived. Then, voices in the forest, maybe villagers, maybe Japanese, and every man there knew what the Japanese did to captured airmen. There was no way to carry 2 stretcher cases and move fast enough to matter. So Flying Officer Harry Smith, 21 years old, 12 days, made the decision that I think about more than any other moment in this story. He sent the survivors away, under Major Gildy. He gave Gildy his own revolver, his compass, and his map, and stayed behind alone with a dying man he'd met the day before to wait for whatever the voices turned out to be. His memoir gives that decision one sentence of commentary. Quote, "Not an easy decision, but whoever said war was easy." End quote. He sat with Naparolsky and tried to comfort him, and the corporal died without waking. Then Harry, bleeding heavily from a scalp wound in his forehead, alone in a Japanese-occupied forest with a Sten gun between his knees, rested against a tree and waited. "5,000 miles away in Winnipeg, it was still yesterday. So on or about the 4th of June, the date confirmed directly on the telegram itself, a message moved through the wires of the RCAF casualties officer addressed to a suite on Furby Street in Winnipeg. Roy Hodgson Smith and Eleanor Hilton Smith, my great-grandmother's sister, were about to join a fellowship no family ever chooses. The Hines family of Newfoundland had joined it in July of 1916. Now, 29 years later, almost to the season, it was our Winnipeg kitchen the news came to. The telegram read, "To Mr. R.H. Smith, 26 Furby Street, Suite 6, Winnipeg. From RCAF Casualties Officer. Regret to advise that your son, Flying Officer Harry Vincent Smith, is reported missing after air operations overseas May 29th. Stop. Letter follows." That's what the telegram read. Missing, not killed. Missing, which every wartime family understood was its own particular cruelty, a word you could neither grieve nor hope on. The Hines family lived inside that word for months in 1916, and it ended in the worst way. The Smiths of Furby Street now began their own vigil. What they could not know, what nobody in Canada knew, was that at that very moment their son was traveling by bullock cart through the Siamese countryside bandaged by strangers, guarded by policemen who were secretly at war with their own occupiers, and heading, of all places on this earth, for a palace. That story, the Underground Railroad of Siam, is next. Okay, the voices in the forest were not Japanese. They were villagers. They were looking for him. They had already found Major Gildy's party, and they'd been sent back for the two men left behind, for Harry and for Naparalski, who was past all help. Naparalski had a gaping hole in his abdomen. They knew from the start he'd never survive. And here's the thing you have to understand about what happened next, because it's the hinge on which this whole story turns. None of this was luck. The people of that drop zone had been waiting for that aircraft. The supplies in P for Peter's Bombay were meant for them. When the drop became a crash, the network that had been ready to receive 14 containers simply received 9 survivors instead. Because here's the extraordinary truth about wartime Siam. Thailand today. And Harry's memoir lays it out with the bluntness of a man who owed it his life. The country was occupied by the Japanese. Its government had formally declared war on Britain. And yet, in Harry's words, quote, although the Japanese occupied Siam, all of their army, navy, air force, and police made up the Free Thai underground with the Regent of Siam in command. We had been instructed that if we were ever shot down in Siam, to surrender to the Siam forces who would protect us from the Japanese. End quote. Think about what that sentence describes. An entire state apparatus, so Army, Navy, Air Force, police, conducting one war in public and its opposite in private, under the command of the Regent himself, ruling in the name of a king who had spent the entire war in Switzerland. The aircrew briefing at Joshua had it exactly right. If you go down in Siam, surrender to the Siamese. They are officially your enemy, and they will save your life. And they did. Methodically, bravely, at absurd risk. What follows is essentially an underground railroad improvised across 400 kilometers of occupied country, and I want to walk you through it station by station, because at every stop, Thai people put their lives between these strangers and the Japanese. All right, Station 1, the village. Bamboo huts on stilts. Harry compared it to something out of National Geographic. A bowl of hot rice broth, a mirror produced so he could fold the flap of his own scalp back into place and bandage it. Also, somewhere in here, a local opportunist made off with Harry's wristwatch on a white horse. And I love Cousin Harry's reaction 50 years later. Quote, well, I thought he's welcome. End quote. The man had just lost 4 of his crew and crash landed a bomber, the watch he could spare. Station 2, the warning. Next morning, a Thai police lieutenant arrived on horseback. A Japanese patrol was coming. The village had to be emptied of airmen now. They left by bullock cart. The memoir records, almost in passing, that the Japanese patrol searched that village half an hour after they left, and then it records what happened to that patrol. The Thai police ambushed it and buried the bodies. That is the level of commitment we're talking about. There was no halfway in for those policemen. Station 3, the long haul south. 2 days by bullock cart with the wounded, McCarthy with his broken back, carried across Japanese guarded railway line by Copley and Rowe, and the memoir notes he never once made a sound. A boat on the river, a night on an island where a Chinese couple fed them a hot meal and the wife rolled them cigarettes the size of cigars using 2 chopsticks. The house of Captain Ryan Pachitul, police captain of Naguan Sawan province, and 2 more days flat in the bottom of a motor launch ducking Japanese patrol boats. And somewhere in there, the last K ration, the last 4 Camel cigarettes, and a matchbook whose printed message struck 9 fugitives in occupied Siam as the funniest thing they had ever read. Quote, "Jolly good luck to you, whoever you are, from Dromedary Foods, Chicago, Illinois, USA." End quote. Station 4, Bangkok. A city garrisoned by 15,000 Japanese soldiers. They rode into it on an ancient bus with straw mats over the windows in conical rain hats that would fool nobody who looked twice, while soldiers stood close enough to touch. They slept on boards at the Thai police headquarters and bathed, Harry the prairie kid noting the spot looked exactly like a farm water hole back home, in a mud puddle where he managed to lose what he was assured was the last bar of soap in the entire army. And here's a detail I still can't quite believe. One of those coincidences you'd cut from fiction. The reason Bangkok had no power or water that night? An RAF raid had knocked them out. The raid was flown by 356 Squadron, and in one of those aircraft operating a movie camera was a bomb aimer from Winnipeg named Jim Gibson. Harry's best friend bombed the city Harry was hiding in, and neither of them knew. They found out months later, presumably over drinks in Darjeeling, and I would give a great deal to have heard that conversation. In the small hours of one morning, Harry was shaken awake by Major Gildy and 2 Americans he'd never seen, Major Dick Greenlee and Captain Howard Palmer of the OSS, running a secret intelligence post in the middle of occupied Bangkok. And the address of that post is the detail this episode has been walking toward since the cold open. The OSS operated from inside the palace of the Regent of Siam. The family story, the one that came down to me, and the one Harry told me himself, says Harry was hidden in the King of Siam's castle. You can see how 50 years of retelling rounds it that way, but the documented truth is, I'd argue, better. Not the king. The king was away in Switzerland, where he'd spent essentially the whole war. The regent, the man actually running the country, running its secret resistance and running an Allied intelligence station out of his own home under the noses of 15,000 Japanese troops. His OSS codename, Harry tells us, was Ruth. What happened in that palace over the following days swings between field surgery and farce, and the memoir gives us both. The surgery. 2 Thai doctors, one trained in England, one in New York, working for hours on the Regent's elegant dining table. Harry's scalp was stitched with a curved shoemaker's needle gripped in a pair of electrician's pliers. The wound flushed clean with a car battery tester. I'm not kidding. It took 4 men to set Major Gildy's broken collarbone, and when it slipped in the night and they risked a hospital run for plaster casts, a Japanese patrol appeared, and Gildy, 6 foot plus, 250 pounds, hid, by his own cheerful confession, behind a tiny nurse. The farce. The food came in on foot from a 5-star hotel 4 miles away, carried by servants with shoulder yokes. There was ice cream. And at one point, the regent, worried on the evidence of a previous OSS guest who had cracked under the isolation about his visitors' morale, proposed a program of rest and recreation so lavishly inappropriate that the OSS officers vetoed it on security grounds, prompting the regent's immortal protest, faithfully preserved in the memoir, quote, "But Dick, even I can't afford these women," end quote. But under the comedy, the clock was ticking, and the memoir never lets you forget it. Informants had begun watching the palace from across the street. A speedboat sat moored at the river's edge behind the property, and a plan had been made that tells you everything about the stakes. The OSS men, plus Harry, the captain, the man who knew what the mission really was, plus one more airman, Curly Copley, chosen for his long overseas service, would be smuggled out of the country. The other 4 surviving crew would deliberately walk into Thai internment, tell the Japanese the Liberator had been a weather flight, and, with 5 graves at the crash site, let the enemy conclude the entire crew was accounted for. 4 men volunteered to sit out the war in a camp as cover so that the underground that saved them would stay invisible. Harry woke Timber Woods in the night to give him the story he'd have to hold under interrogation. Think about handing that job to a friend. The exit itself nearly ended on the first mile. A midnight bus, carrying among others an escaped Australian prisoner from the Burma Railway, a silent figure of skin and bone we will come back to, began backfiring on a hill in the heart of curfewed Bangkok. A Japanese patrol closed in. Inside the bus, in the dark, came the sound Harry describes with terrible economy. The clicking of breech blocks. 9 men deciding, without a word, that they would not be taken. And outside, a Thai police driver calmly explaining to the patrol that he was transporting prisoners to jail, while keeping the starter engaged the whole time, walking the bus over the crest of a hill until it could coast silently down the far side out of reach. They hid in the horse stalls of an abandoned racetrack until cars came to fetch them back to the palace. Harry's tribute? Quote, incredible ingenuity, courage, and control. End quote. Second escape attempt, the next night, north to a village airstrip at Ban Pei, and an air evacuation that sounds like something out of a cartoon, except every word is sourced. Harry, Gildy, and Moore flew in an antique Fairchild, piloted, Harry records this with a connoisseur's delight, by no less than the head of the entire Thai Air Force, personally flying getaway for Allied evaders. The engine run-up showed a magneto drop of 400 RPM, which for the non-pilots listening means the engine was politely warning them not to fly. They flew. Copley's little Taylor craft got lost and had to force land and was rescued by yet another aircraft. The rest traveled by small twin Beechcraft. Somehow, everyone arrived. And then, the 14th of June, 1945, onto that upcountry strip dropped a Dakota of 357 Squadron, flown by Flight Lieutenant Lewis. Aboard, a replacement OSS team heading in to carry on the work, and cases of American beer and cigarettes heading out with the evaders. It was Harry Smith's first ever taste of Budweiser. I'm going to give him the line because it might be my favorite sentence in the whole memoir. So in Harry's words, quote, "This was my first taste of the famous Budweiser beer, and I order it today just to relish the memory of that first taste." End quote. Now, the last time I saw Harry, in the summer of 1997, he was drinking a Bud. But I digress. The Dakota's elevator fabric had torn on the rough strip. They patched it with a piece of cloth and some glue. Cloth and glue. Refueled at Rangoon, retaken from the Japanese only weeks before, and 7 hours later, touchdown at Alipore Airport, Calcutta. Harry's closing arithmetic on the whole ordeal, quote, "It was difficult to believe that the entire episode had only taken 3 weeks," end quote. On the 25th of June, 1945, casualty list number 1086 crossed the decks of the RCAF carrying a one-word amendment on the file of J.27671 Smith, HV. Safe. Somewhere on Furby Street in Winnipeg, 27 days of silence ended. We don't have the second telegram. What survives in the file is the internal casualty card, confirmed twice over, rather than the wire that would have gone to the family. But we know the exact day the word changed. And that stark single word in a ledger column might be the most beautiful piece of bureaucratic prose I've ever read. My Hines family in Newfoundland never got a second telegram. The Smiths did. 2 wars, 2 telegrams, and this time the boy was coming home. Almost. First, there was a debt to pay, and it was paid in silence in Calcutta. Harry and Curly Copley spent their first 2 weeks of freedom in hiding. Not from the Japanese, from everyone. Escape and Evasion Headquarters, Calcutta, run by Squadron leader Huxley, kept the 2 of them and the silent Australian out of sight. And the reason is the whole moral of this section of the episode. Every day their escape stayed secret was the day the villagers, the police captain, the bus driver, the doctors, and the Regent himself stayed alive. And their 4 crewmates were still inside, holding the cover story in an internment camp. You don't get to celebrate surviving until the people who saved you are saved too. The 4 interned men came out about 2 months later for, in the memoir's words, a grand celebration. The loop closed. Everyone who went into the forest alive came out. It was in Calcutta that Harry learned the final bitter detail of Mission 25. Japanese fighter squadrons had moved onto a base near his flight path the very day they took off. 24 sorties of monsoon and darkness had protected him. On the 25th, the weather cleared. The fighters were new to the neighborhood and every card turned over wrong at once. And it was in Calcutta that this story touches the wider war in a way I find almost unbearable. And I'm going to handle it the way the memoir does, briefly and with care. Remember the Australian who came out with them had survived the Burma-Siam Railway, built on the bones of Allied prisoners and Asian forced laborers. He was, in Harry's words, just skin and bones. And for days, he crouched in corners and did not speak. In the safety of Calcutta, slowly, he began to. And then one evening, the group was taken to the cinema, a kindness, a taste of ordinary life. And the Pathé newsreel showed the Allied liberation of the German concentration camps. And he broke down completely. One survivor, seeing on a screen what had been done on the other side of the world to people just like him. Harry writes that the group was deeply troubled and spent every hour they could helping him recover. We don't know his name. I didn't want him to pass through this story unremarked. In July, Harry went to Darjeeling and kept, 1 month late, the appointment he'd made before Mission 25, the reunion with Jim Gibson. 2 school friends from St. James enlisted together in May 1942, meeting in the Himalayan foothills with, between them, 1 bombing raid on Bangkok and 1 escape from Bangkok to compare over drinks. And the memoir closes that scene with one of the great cliffhanger sentences a veteran ever wrote. Quote, "It was here that I made my second escape, but that is another story." End quote. Cousin Harry never wrote that story down. We don't know what it was. At least I don't. Yet. The war ended in August. The paperwork of gratitude followed at its own pace. The Distinguished Flying Cross was gazetted on the 14th of August, 1945, while Harry was still overseas. And here I owe you the kind of honesty this show trades in. The citation says 3 members of his crew were killed. The memoir and the graves in that forest say 4: Poole, Brenchley, Draper, and Pinckney. The citation was almost certainly drafted from first reports in the fog between missing and safe, and never corrected. I flag it not to diminish the medal, but because it's a perfect specimen of something we meet constantly on this show. The official record is a snapshot of what was known at a desk on a date, not of what was true in the forest or in the field. When the two disagree, you keep both, and you say so out loud. And that's this podcast's entire method in one sentence. In November came the French decoration, reproduced at the back of the memoir, and it is a small masterpiece of wartime paperwork saying one thing while meaning another. And it says it in both French and English. And because I don't speak French, I am going to read you the English version. Now, bear with me while I translate this. The citation is from General de Gaulle, President of the Provisional Government of the Republic of France, awarded to Flight Officer Smith, 358 Squadron, Operation Mouche, for exceptional war services rendered in the course of the operations for the liberation of France. Signed under de Gaulle's authority, Paris, 2nd November 1945. And the operation it names, Operation Mouche, Mouche is French for fly, make of that what you will, happened roughly 10,000 kilometers from France on those 7 long night sorties into French Indochina we talked about earlier in this episode. The form said France because the form always said France. The truth said Hanoi, Saigon. Harry wore the Croix de Guerre with the Silver Star for 60 years. And I'd wager nearly everyone who noticed it assumed Normandy. Nobody assumes Hanoi. He came home through Bournemouth and Lachine and was released at No. 5 Release Center, Winnipeg in the winter of 1945-46, home for Christmas, with 30 days leave and his whole life in front of him. 21 years old and finished with the war. Except for one more parade. On the 16th of May, 1946, at Stevenson Field in Winnipeg, the Lieutenant Governor of Manitoba, R.F. McWilliams, pinned the Distinguished Flying Cross on Flying Officer Harry Vincent Smith, retired. The photograph survived. It's in the memoir. Now check that date against the one we opened the start of this episode with, the 17th of May. Harry received his DFC the day before his 22nd birthday. He enlisted the day after a birthday and was decorated the day before one. His entire war fits between 2 birthday cards 4 years apart. His DFC citation, as quoted in the Minister of National Defense for Air's letter to Mr. and Mrs. R.H. Smith, 12 September 1945, reads, quote, "Although the aircraft was severely damaged and one engine put out of action in the first attack, this captain and his crew fought with great resolution. The enemy pressed home further attacks and with great persistence, and Flying Officer Smith's aircraft sustained further damage. Even so, Flying Officer Smith, though wounded, successfully crash-landed the crippled aircraft, thus saving the lives of the remaining members of his crew. In the face of great odds, this officer set a fine example of coolness and bravery." End quote. And then Harry Smith did the most remarkable thing of all. The thing his whole generation did. He put it away and built a life. He got a civil engineering degree from the University of Manitoba, a career with Atomic Energy of Canada, and his obituary tells us exactly which 5 projects he was proudest of. The nuclear research stations at Chalk River and Pinawa, the Nelson River power transmission line, and assignments in Buenos Aires and Seoul. Follow that arc for a second. The 21-year-old who crash-landed a liberator in the Siamese jungle came home and spent 4 decades helping build the machinery of modern Canada. He married Barbara Janet Sproule. They raised a family. And my family remembers him in a particular way. And since I'm the one holding the microphone, you get it firsthand. Cousin Harry was boisterous, jovial, always grinning, always ready with a story. The man who filled the room. He never introduced himself as a war hero. He told the light stories, the sunsets over the Bay of Bengal, the wristwatch on the white horse, the last bar of soap in the entire army, and he let the memoir hold the rest. The darkness went down on paper once, precisely, and with his surviving crewmates as co-authors. The laughter, he handed it out in person for 60 years. I don't think that's avoidance. I think it's a decision. The same species of decision as staying behind with Naparolsky. You carry the heavy thing yourself so the people around you don't have to. Now, the last time I saw Harry, he did tell me a little bit about the darker side of that particular escape, the crash, the wounds, but he always managed to smile at the end of his story. Perhaps he was just thankful to have survived. He never stopped flying either. The Winnipeg Flying Club, the Wartime Pilots and Observers Association, a group magnificently named the Burma Bombers. And in the early 1980s, the Canadian Warplane Heritage Museum in Hamilton, where this story performs its final impossible loop. I promised you earlier in the episode it would be worth the wait. So here it is. One winter morning, Harry, retired engineer, just another volunteer in a cold hangar, wandered over to where a crew was restoring a Cessna crane. The humble prairie trainers stripped to bare wood. He mentioned he'd earned his wings on cranes and asked if he could help. He became, the restoration crew's own words, the spark plug of the whole project. And only near the end, when he asked what markings they planned to paint on her, did the history come out. She was Crane 7862 from number 4 Service Flying Training School, Saskatoon. His school. And when they went looking, there was a photograph of Harry's graduating class, B Flight, June 1943, lined up for the camera with aircraft 7862 standing in the frame behind them. He had, it turned out, restored with his own hands, 40 years later and 2,000 kilometers away, an aircraft that stood behind him on the day he got his wings. The friend who recorded that story wrote that the Almighty works in strange ways. I'll only say, sometimes history is a better plotter than any novelist would dare to be. Harry wrote it all down eventually, with Copley, Woods, Rowe, and Pugh, the survivors, as co-authors building on accounts Copley and Woods had first set down in 1954. Look at the date on the title page if you have a look at the memoir. I'll post it to my website. The 29th of May, 1995. 50 years after the crash to the day. He chose the anniversary. Whatever he carried, he knew exactly where it lived in the calendar. Harry Vincent Smith died in Winnipeg on the 17th of March, 2005, at the age of 80. With courage, says the obituary. Given everything you know about the man, I believe every word of it. Before we go, the roll of honor. On this show, the dead get their names said out loud. Flight Sergeant Bob Poole, second pilot, killed lightning the aircraft to save his crew. Flight Sergeant Lofty Brenchley, navigator. Flight Sergeant Jack Draper, bomb aimer. Flight Sergeant Bill Pinkney, mid-upper gunner, who fired until he was hit. And Corporal Naparolsky of the OSS, who died in a forest in Siam, but not alone, because a 21-year-old from Winnipeg stayed behind. They rest at Kanchanaburi, among the dead of the very railway their silent Australian companions survived. Harry's memoir opens with a phrase he throws around almost casually, the forgotten war. Like it's just a fact of life he stopped being surprised by decades ago. I want you to hear that same argument made by someone else who was there, because he says it better than I can. Charles Richard Sharpe was born in St. Catharines, Ontario on the 11th of February 1925, barely a year older than Harry. He served in the Burma Theatre too, and years later, in a recorded interview with Veterans Affairs, he puts his finger on exactly the resentment men like Harry's crew would have recognized instantly. That Europe got everything first, the equipment, the coverage, the commemoration, and Burma got what was left over. He even reaches for a line from Lord Mountbatten himself, spoken to the men of the 14th Army that Sharpe never forgot. So here's Richard Sharpe.
I was on a VE day. I was tour expired on the squadron, and I was over at another squadron with other duties that I was as an instructor on, trying to teach Liberator pilots, or at least Lancaster pilots, about Liberators. Well, then that program was given up, so I wasn't doing anything really. We had a hurricane, and the hurricane came through and it wiped out the squadron, and knocked down all the buildings, ruined all 16 aircraft we had, and it set the mess on fire, which burned down. And so we didn't have, and while all this had taken place, someone said it was VE Day in Europe. Well, we discovered that while the mess had burned down, the bar supplies had perished, and we were able to make our way into the bar supplies, and we had ourselves a pretty good party, and with the excuse that it was victory in Europe. But really, our war was Japan, and we always felt resentful of Europe because they got everything first. Everything that was any good, they got first. They had radar on their aircraft long before we ever saw any of it in the Far East. Then the Middle East was getting the next wave of equipment, and it seemed to be what was left over found its way to the Burma theater. And it was literally the forgotten war. It was not a big press thing in Europe or in Canada or the U.S. The U.S. was the Pacific, and that's what they were in, Europe. But Canada and Britain were really Europe, and the invasion of Europe, and we know all about that. And the way things were handled with the VE Day and the D-Day landing celebrations, the 60th celebrations, and what has been done in connection with this, with the victory in Japan, victory over Japan, has had relatively little coverage, and it's sort of almost an afterthought. But there is a resentment because there's always a short end of the stick for the Burma group, whether it was the transport fellows or the bomb group. And even Mountbatten was aware of this and spoke to the 14th Army people. It's a famous quote in a book that's around that you're not the forgotten army because people have to know, you have to be known before you can be forgotten. And they've never even heard of you.
You have to be known before you can be forgotten. Harry's squadron flew 24 of 28 crews into the ground in 6 months, and almost nobody at home ever heard about it. That's what this episode has been trying to fix, in whatever small way one show can. The family history said Harry was hidden in the King of Siam's castle. The truth was a regent, not a king, and the whole secret nation of villagers, policemen, doctors, bus drivers, and one Air Force chief moonlighting as a getaway pilot, every one of them risking torture and death for 14 strangers who fell out of their sky. My great-great-aunt Eleanor got the second telegram that the Hines family 29 years earlier never did, and that truly is why this episode exists, because the distance between those two telegrams, between missing and safe, between 1916 and 1945, between the trenches this show usually walks and a jungle half a world away, is where my family, and I suspect possibly yours too, actually lives. That's it for this episode of Memory and Valor. We're going to end it here, and I want to thank you for spending this hour and a bit with me yet again. And I want to thank you for listening to the story of my cousin Harry. Harry is somebody who is forever, permanently etched in my mind. I adored him. He was a wonderful guy, a wonderful family member to me, and always with a joke. He was, like I said, he was jovial, he was fun, and he laughed things off in life. Maybe sometimes to his own detriment, but I remember Harry in a really good way. And though he told me some of his stories, he never told them quite like this. So there was a humility. He was a humble guy and not the tallest guy in the world, but he took up a lot of space in a room because of his boisterous personality. So this one is for Harry, and this one is for my very large and very extended Smith family, many of whom I haven't seen in decades and many of whom I haven't met. And hopefully through the power of the interwebs, they'll hear this episode. If you do, contact me. I can be reached at memoryandvalor@gmail.com or visit the website www.memoryandvalor.ca. If this story moved you, please follow the show and consider supporting it at Buy Me a Coffee. You go to buymeacoffee.com, you search Memory and Valor, my profile will pop up, and you can absolutely support this show by making a donation by way of buying me a coffee, which is just a super fun way of saying, please support me. Hope you all have a great day. Until next time, remember, keep history alive, because where memory endures, valor lives on.